midterm years historically have ended up being great times to buy, especially sort of mid to late year, if history is any indication. So in order to make money in the bull markets, the people that made the most money in these bull markets were the people that stuck around in the bear and got those good opportunities. So my encouragement to you would be stick around in the midterm year, look for opportunities, and hopefully you can reap the rewards as we get out into the next market cycle.
As we enter 2026, it's worth taking a step back and honestly assessing what happened in Bitcoin throughout 2025. Over the past year, a dominant narrative has taken hold across crypto social media. The 4-year cycle is broken. The argument is simple on the surface. 2025 ended as a red year, and historically, post-halving years were supposed to be strong. But markets are rarely that simple. Bitcoin does not operate in a vacuum, and no cycle is guaranteed to repeat perfectly. While many price predictions for 2025 ultimately failed, some dramatically, it's important to remember a fundamental truth of markets. Nobody knows the future with certainty. Every model, including cycle theory, is probabilistic, not prophetic. Before we go on, just a quick reminder, liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and commenting helps this reach more people who care about Bitcoin and macro trends. Appreciate the support. Let's continue.
2026 is here, and I want to talk about 2025, what happened. A lot of people have said the 4-year cycle is broken because this is the first red candle here that was technically red in the post-halving year. You can't really include this one over here because Bitcoin launched back then. There wasn't really a lot of data. 2010, I guess, was an example of Bitcoin going up in the midterm year. It went up a modest 43,000% that year. So I guess not all midterm years have been bad. But one of the things to consider is that the future is never guaranteed, right? There were plenty of price predictions for where Bitcoin would be by the end of 2025, and most of them more or less just fell flat on their face. So it's just a reminder that at the end of the day, no one knows what is going to happen in the markets, and we're all just simply doing the best we can. Now, one of the things that I think we should discuss is the fact that while this was a red year, Bitcoin still technically topped in the 4th quarter of the post-halving year, right? So this top occurred when all the other prior tops occurred in post-halving years. So in a sense, while there's a narrative going around that the 4-year cycle was broken, it's not really that different. In fact, last cycle, Bitcoin dropped from November into the end of the year as well, but it ended up being a green year, even though we dropped going into the end of the year, just like we did this year. So the other thing that I want to show is if you look at quarterly returns, what you'll notice is that in Q4 of 2013, Bitcoin went up 421%. In Q4 of 2017, it went up 220%. And in Q4 of 2021, it went up 5%. And then in Q4 of 2025, it dropped 23%. So every Q4 has actually gotten progressively worse from one cycle to another, Q4 of the post-halving year. There are some other trends that I think we should also look at. One of those trends is, of course, as it relates to the altcoin market. We talked about that a lot, and we talked about why it made sense to sort of fade the alt season calls, and if you're going to stick with anything in crypto, just stick with Bitcoin. And it's this chart right here. You can see that alts have actually dropped to Bitcoin now 4 years in a row. So they dropped 22% in 2022, 30% in 2023. Altcoins then dropped 13% against Bitcoin in 2024 and 14% against Bitcoin in 2025. So yes, it is true that Bitcoin did not go up durably in the post-halving year, but it's also true that had you just stuck with Bitcoin for the last few years, even if you didn't sell, you're doing incredibly better than you would have been doing if you were buying random altcoins, right? And that's kind of the reality that was kind of the message I was trying to say, is that, you know, whenever Bitcoin does find a top, assuming that the business cycle plays out like last business cycle around the time that QT ends, there might not be that final rotation. Now we know definitively that there wasn't in the post-halving year. And I think you could argue it was just because of higher for longer monetary policy, which then of course led to really low social interest in the cryptoverse. So this year was red. Now, if you go over to the year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin in 2025, this is what it looked like, right? So you can see we started off the year with a little bit of a rally, and then after the inauguration, we had the post-inauguration dump. We even called January 20th as being a local top, I think 7 or 8 months ahead of time, that January 20th would likely be a local top for the crypto markets. We were able to hold above the 2024 high in the dump back in February, March, and April of 2025. And therefore, we suggested we should then get a right translated cycle into a market cycle top in the fourth quarter of the post-halving year. So technically speaking, Bitcoin had its top this cycle in the fourth quarter of the post-halving year. We could leave it at that and move on with our lives. But as I said in another video, there's something that just kind of feels awful when you think about it like that. One of the ways you might be able to explain the lack of interest is look at the divergence here on the higher highs in price, but the lower highs in the weekly RSI. So there's already been very low interest for a while, right? Yes, Bitcoin has gone higher, but it only marginally went higher, right? I mean, Bitcoin started the year above 90,000 and then it ended the year below 90,000. So yes, technically it went higher, but it was on sort of weaker and weaker rallies. This setup looks somewhat similar to the setup in 2021 going into 2022, when you also had lower highs in the weekly RSI. In fact, the final high on the weekly RSI in 2021 occurred at a weekly RSI of around 68 to 69, and this time it occurred around 70. So in some ways, it was very similar. You could argue that right now, we're just kind of sitting in this area after that big dump going into the midterm year. All right, so somewhere kind of in this zone is where it seems like the most likely place that we are in terms of where Bitcoin is on the current potential 4-year cycle.
Another critical insight comes from reconsidering how Bitcoin is measured. Bitcoin priced in USD will almost always trend upward long-term, not necessarily because Bitcoin is strengthening, but because the dollar is weakening. The purchasing power of fiat currencies declines over time by design. So, to gain a clearer picture, Bitcoin must also be measured against other assets.
There's something else, though, that I think we have to address. And that's the fact that the denominator means a lot, right? So in this case, we're looking at Bitcoin, and we're dividing it by the US dollar. Now, the problem with doing that over a long enough period of time is that we already know that the purchasing power of the US dollar is asymptotically going to zero. We already know that, right? Like if you do a chart of the purchasing power of the US dollar, it essentially looks like this. And this is why, you know, everything just goes up over time. This is why inflation exists, is they'll never stop printing more money. Therefore, the US dollar theoretically will never stop being devalued. And so one of the things you can do is you can actually measure Bitcoin against other things. And you can actually measure the entire cryptoverse against other things. It's the same reason for why we spent so much time measuring altcoins against Bitcoin. It's the same reason. Why bother when you can just hold the king of the cryptoverse and outperform most everything else? Why bother with all the nonsense, you know? Sleep better at night. And don't worry if some founder of some project's going to rug you for whatever reason. And so that was the argument. And so again, if you look at Bitcoin on its USD pair, it did top in the fourth quarter of the post-halving year. So the predictions ultimately panned out. But if you measure Bitcoin against something else, it didn't, right? So first of all, let's measure it against the S&P 500. If you measure Bitcoin against the S&P 500, it actually topped in July. So you could argue that it actually topped a little bit sooner when measuring it against stocks. Okay? That's the first time that we've seen, I believe, a high in July when measured against the stock market. Last cycle, Bitcoin also put in a high earlier in the cycle when you measure it against stocks, right? It put in a high in April of 2021, and then the November high was a lower high against stocks. And that's why I think a lot of people felt like the true top last cycle was the April top rather than the November top. But where it gets the most interesting is when you value Bitcoin against gold. Because if you value it against gold, Bitcoin actually topped in December of 2024. It topped in December. And this is the first time that has happened. Because in 2017, Bitcoin topped in December of the post-halving year. And in 2021, it topped in November of the post-halving year. But this time, Bitcoin topped against gold essentially a full year earlier than it normally does. And I think that's a very interesting observation. Now, of course, some people say, well, does that mean the bear market's over if we've already been going for a year? I don't know that it's going to work like that. To play devil's advocate, if you looked at the weekly RSI of Bitcoin against gold, you would notice that we're actually at levels that historically have been generally good times to buy Bitcoin. But the problem is that even last cycle, when we went down to this level, it wasn't actually the bottom, right? We still had a divergent higher high on the weekly RSI, even though it led to a lower price. Just like we've had higher highs here in the price, but the weekly RSI was at a lower high. So hopefully that makes sense. The RSI is not the best indicator to use. So my guess is that we're going to have more or less a continuation of the same until monetary policy sufficiently changes. That is my guess as to how this is ultimately going to play out. You know, could there be a rally back up to the 50-week moving average in 2026? I told you guys back in October when the bear market started not to expect a counter trend rally until 2026. Back in 2022, we had the counter trend rally to the 50-week moving average in March. And in 2018, the counter trend rally to the 50-week moving average did not occur until July. So the reason I said not to expect it for the last month or so is just kind of looking back at history and saying, look, historically it takes until the midterm year to get that counter trend rally. There is no such thing as a guarantee, though. In 2014, we never actually quite made it back up to the 50-week SMA until the bear market was actually over. So don't look at that as a sure thing. The other thing is that there is still the potential here of sweeping this low here. It seems to me like it's likely going to come into play at some point in 2026. I couldn't tell you exactly when, but I think that will be an important level. The other important level is the yearly open. So Bitcoin, you know, where it opened the year right around these prices, I think that's going to be an important pivot level for a while. And the reason I say that is if you look at where Bitcoin opened in 2022, it essentially opened at around, between 40 and 50K right here. And then Bitcoin dumped when the year started, and then it rallied back up to that level that it was at when it opened the year, right? So the yearly open ended up being resistance in the midterm year at the 50-week moving average. The other thing, in the 2018 yearly open, Bitcoin opened the year, I believe at around like 14K, give or take. And then that level ended up being resistance in the 2019 rally. So the yearly open where we are right now, I have a feeling will come into play in the future, right? It's going to act as some important level that's going to be respected for a while in this coming market cycle. That is my best guess.
As we move deeper into 2026, patience and perspective matter more than ever. Bitcoin has survived worse conditions than this. But survival does not require blind optimism. It requires discipline, risk management, and humility. Cycles change, macro matters, liquidity leads. And as always, the goal isn't to predict the future with certainty. It's to stack probabilities, manage risk, and stay adaptable as the data evolves. Because in the end, markets don't reward conviction alone. They reward preparation.